Picture this. It's late 322, maybe early 321 BC. And you're standing on this dusty road in the ancient Middle East.
Right.
And rumbling toward you is just, I mean, it's the most extravagant funeral procession the world has literally ever seen.
It is massive.
Yeah, we are talking about a giant golden carriage, like engineered specifically to carry the body of Alexander the Great on this slow, deliberate march all the way back to Macedon.
And the stakes for who controls that procession,
Yeah.
They're unfathomable.
Exactly. And then out of nowhere, one of Alexander's former bodyguards swoops in, physically hijacks the conqueror's corpse, and just reroutes the entire caravan to Egypt.
It is, without a doubt, one of the most audacious heists in human history.
Yeah.
When you're looking at the theft of the ultimate symbol of imperial legitimacy.
Right, out from under the nose of the standing government.
Exactly. Just snatched it.
So the mastermind who actually pulled this off was a Macedonian general named Ptolemy Isoter. And that's what today's deep dive into our sources is all about. We're unpacking the mechanics of his survival.
Because Ptolemy didn't just, survive the chaotic, blood-soaked fallout of Alexander's death.
No, he engineered a 300-year dynasty, the same dynasty that famously ended with Cleopatra VII.
That's really incredible when you think about it.
Right. So if you're listening to this and wondering how leaders navigate catastrophic power vacuums, Ptolemy's playbook is basically a masterclass. Defensive architecture, economic manipulation, narrative control. He did it all.
And the broader context here is just so critical because Ptolemy wasn't the obvious heir to the empire. Not at all.
Right. He was just a guy.
Well, a very capable guy.
Yeah.
But his success really stems from understanding the difference between the illusion of power and the actual boring levers of administration.
Right. The real plumbing. So let's start with the heist itself, because to understand why someone takes the massive risk of stealing their boss's dead body.
Which is huge.
Yeah. We have to look at his proximity to the throne. He wasn't just some rank-and-file soldier.
Right. Far from it. Ptolemy was a Macedonian Greek. He was born around 369 or 368 BC to a nobleman named Legis and a woman named Arsinoe.
Okay.
And he actually served with Alexander from his earliest campaigns. He rose to become one of the 7 Somatophylakes.
The what?
Somatophylakes. They were the elite royal bodyguards. But honestly, the title is almost deceptive.
How so? Like, they weren't just the guys standing at the door looking tough.
Exactly. They weren't just muscle. They were the inner circle of staff officers. I mean, Ptolemy held independent military commands.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he most notably captured the rebel Bessus in Afghanistan.
Okay, so he's a serious player.
Very serious. So when Alexander dies suddenly in Babylon, this is in 323 BC, and the empire is partitioned, Ptolemy has the leverage to maneuver himself into the role of satrap.
Which is like a governor, right?
Right, governor of Egypt.
Okay, but our sources also mention this lingering rumor, something about Ptolemy actually being the illegitimate son of Philip II, which would make him Alexander's half-brother.
Ah, yes, that rumor.
Yeah. I mean, I have to wonder, did he just manufacture that rumor to justify his massive land grab?
Modern historians overwhelmingly view that rumor as a later fabrication. But, its function is really telling.
Because he needed the PR.
Basically.
Huh.
The Ptolemaic dynasty eventually needed a way to tie their bloodline directly to the greatest conquerors of the age.
Right, to look legitimate.
But in 323 BC, Ptolemy wasn't relying on fabricated bloodlines. He was relying on immediate political realities.
Because there's a guy in charge, right, Perdiccas.
Yes, the official imperial regent, Perdiccas. He controlled the central government, and he fully intended to bury Alexander in the royal tombs in Macedon.
Which would solidify his own supremacy.
Exactly. Which brings us to the mechanics of Macedonian succession. It wasn't just about reading a will or who had the best claim on paper.
Right, it's much more visceral than that.
Very. Custom actually dictated that a new king asserted his right to the throne by physically burying his predecessor.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. It's almost like stealing the company founder's last will and testament to automatically make yourself the new CEO.
That's a great way to put it. By hijacking the body and taking it to Memphis in Egypt, Ptolemy was systematically short-circuiting the region's claim to the throne.
He's just preempting the central authority completely.
And he wastes absolutely no time consolidating that move.
Yeah, he openly joins a military coalition against Perdiccas.
Yeah.
And then he executes his own deputy in Egypt, a guy named Cleomenes.
Right, and the execution of Cleomenes is it's a perfect example of Ptolemy understanding how power works.
Because Cleomenes was a spy.
Well, officially, yes, he was suspected of spying for Perdiccas. But by eliminating him, Ptolemy didn't just remove a rival.
What else did he get?
He legally absorbed the staggering wealth that Cleomenes had spent years hoarding in the Egyptian treasury.
Oh, wow. So he gets the money.
All of it. And he needed that capital for what was coming next.
Because, obviously, stealing the boss's body triggers a massive retaliation. You can't just do that and expect everyone to be cool with it.
No, absolutely not. Perdiccas marches the entire imperial army down to Egypt in 321 BC.
Right. And this seems to be where Ptolemy's defensive genius really kicks in.
It does. Because invading Egypt essentially requires crossing the Nile. And Ptolemy turned the river itself into a weapon.
How do you do that?
Well, the logistics of moving a heavily armored Macedonian phalanx across those currents, it was a nightmare. Ptolemy fortified all the fords, and Perdiccas' invasion just collapsed into an absolute fiasco.
I read he lost, what, 2,000 men?
2,000 men, simply trying to cross the water.
That is, I mean, that level of logistical failure has to just shatter the morale of an invading army.
It was fatal to Perdiccas' authority. His own officers mutinied and actually murdered him in his tent.
Wow.
Yeah. But the aftermath is where we really see Ptolemy's strategic restraint.
Yeah.
Because the morning after the assassination, Ptolemy crosses the river. But he doesn't slaughter the remaining enemy forces. He brings them grain.
Wait, he supplies the army that just tried to invade him?
Yes.
That is an astonishing psychological pivot. Like, hey guys, sorry about yesterday, here's some breakfast.
It really is. But it neutralizes the immediate threat, right? And it buys their loyalty. The grateful army actually offers Ptolemy the regency of the entire Macedonian Empire right there.
In place of the guy they just killed?
Exactly.
Okay, but I have to challenge the logic of what happens next.
All for it.
So he steals the body to establish legitimacy. He shatters his biggest rival. The imperial army basically hands him the keys to the entire empire, and he turns it down.
He does.
If you refuse the top job in front of your own ambitious generals, don't you look incredibly weak? I mean, how does he survive the optics of just walking away from the ultimate prize?
It's a fair question. But it really comes down to a harsh assessment of geopolitical reality.
Like, he knew it was a trap.
Kind of. Ptolemy recognized that Alexander's empire was fundamentally ungovernable. It was too vast, the supply lines were too long, and the rival generals were just too entrenched.
So whoever takes the job is just a target.
Exactly. Whoever took the regency would be fighting a war on all fronts. And that was a calculation that was proven correct by the decades of civil war that followed.
Right, so it's a conscious choice to avoid imperial overstretch.
Precisely. He preferred an impregnable fortress over a crumbling empire. Egypt was wealthy, agriculturally independent, and geographically protected by deserts and the sea.
The perfect base.
And when he did fight in the long succession wars, the conflicts of the Diadochi, he focused on securing regions like Judea, Cyprus, and Cyrenaica.
But not to conquer everything.
No, these weren't attempts to conquer Asia, they were buffer zones, designed strictly to keep the fighting far away from the Egyptian heartland.
He's basically building a strategic moat around himself.
A very expensive moat, yes.
And it clearly earned him respect. The sources note he was given the title Soter, right? Which means savior.
Yes, that was because he deployed a massive fleet to lift the siege of Rhodes when they were attacked by a rival general around 305 BC.
And they gave him divine honors for that.
Which just shows his soft power at work. But, and this is crucial, maintaining those buffer zones, fleets, and a standing mercenary army, it requires a staggering amount of capital.
Right. Military might is totally useless without an economic engine to drive it.
Exactly.
Which brings us to how you actually pay for all this. And if you're listening to this and you think of ancient economies as just, bartering grain and cattle, Ptolemy's system is going to completely change your perspective.
Oh, absolutely. He implemented a highly structured, state-controlled bureaucracy that honestly borders on total micromanagement.
Yeah, the Ptolemaic state became the primary engine of industry. They owned almost half of all the agricultural land.
And it wasn't just farming. If you were involved in the production of cloth, papyrus, or even brewing beer, you operated under stringent government oversight.
And a heavy taxation framework, I'm sure.
Very heavy. They exported grain and linen across the Mediterranean just to finance their military.
But the monetary policy is the most fascinating mechanism here, I think.
It really is brilliant.
Because before this, under Alexander, the region largely relied on standard Athenian silver coins, right?
Yes, Athenian silver was basically the US dollar of the ancient Mediterranean.
Right. But around 310 BC, Ptolemy engineers what modern economists would call a closed monetary zone.
Yes. And the mechanics of this are just genius. Egypt had almost no native silver mines, meaning silver had to be constantly imported.
Okay, so it's a weak point.
A huge weak point.
Yeah.
So to stop silver from bleeding out of his economy, Ptolemy decreed that any merchant or traveler entering Egypt had to surrender their foreign currency at the border.
Stop. It's literally like a walled garden ecosystem in modern tech or like an ancient theme park. You walk in and you're forced to exchange your real international money for local Ptolemy bucks just to do business.
That's exactly what it was, and the exchange rate was heavily manipulated.
Of course it was. How bad was the skim?
He reduced the weight of the silver and gold drachmas to 80% of their original weight.
Wow.
Essentially, the state skimmed 20% off the top of every single transaction entering the country.
Wait, if you enforce a 20% fractional devaluation overnight, doesn't that immediately trigger massive inflation? Like, wouldn't the merchant class just riot?
It would if they had a choice to go elsewhere. But because Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, merchants had to buy Egyptian grain. The demand was completely inelastic.
They couldn't just walk away. They needed the food.
Exactly.
Huh.
This allowed Ptolemy to create what was essentially a fiduciary currency, money that has value primarily because the state demands it for taxes and trade within its borders.
That is profound. He's literally forcing the entire Mediterranean to play by his financial rules.
And by 299 BC, he visualizes this independence. He stops minting coins with Alexander's face altogether and replaces them with his own portrait.
Imagine being a Greek merchant holding that new coin.
Right. For decades, Alexander's image was the universal standard of value. Swapping that out for his own face wasn't just vanity.
It's a statement.
It was a macroeconomic declaration of independence. Ptolemy was broadcasting that his legitimacy no longer derived from Alexander, but from himself as the living pharaoh.
That is so bold. Okay, so securing the borders and locking down the economy guarantees your survival in the present. But to secure a dynasty that lasts 300 years, you have to control how the future remembers you, right?
You have to monopolize knowledge.
Exactly. And the cultural infrastructure he built in his capital, Alexandria, served exactly that purpose.
It did. I mean, he initiated the construction of the Lighthouse of Alexandria, a navigational wonder. But more importantly, he founded the Library of Alexandria.
Which is so interesting because we tend to think of the library as this, benevolent public good, like a UNESCO site or something. But in this context, it feels more like a geopolitical weapon.
Oh, it was absolutely an institution of statecraft.
How so?
By offering massive stipends, tax exemptions, and resources, Ptolemy initiated a massive brain drain across the Hellenistic world.
He just bought all the smart people?
He drew the greatest mind scientists, poets, engineers, away from his rivals and into his own court.
There's a great interaction in the sources between Ptolemy and Euclid, actually, the father of geometry who Ptolemy sponsored.
Oh, yes, the famous quote.
Yeah, so supposedly Ptolemy was trying to read Euclid's foundational textbook, The Elements, and he just got frustrated. And he asks Euclid if there's a shorter, easier way to learn the material.
And Euclid replies, "Sire, there is no royal road to geometry."
I just love that. He basically told the king to do his homework.
It's a great anecdote, and it highlights that the king was personally engaging with the intellectual heavyweights of his court.
Right.
But Ptolemy wasn't content just being a patron. He took up the pen himself and wrote a detailed eyewitness history of Alexander's campaigns.
And we don't have the original text today, right?
We don't, but it survived long enough to completely shape the historical record. In the 2nd century AD, the historian Arrian used Ptolemy's account as a primary foundation for his famous work, the Anabasis.
Okay, so Arrian read it.
Yes. And Arrian explicitly states that he trusts Ptolemy's version because Ptolemy was an eyewitness, but crucially because he was a king.
Wait, what?
Arrian reasoned that lying would be more dishonorable for him than for anyone else.
I have to stop right there. The idea that a king wouldn't lie in his own memoir that is staggering naivety.
It really is.
He is writing the definitive history of a conflict where he spent decades fighting his bitter rivals for survival. How did this bias actually manifest in the text?
Well, modern historians like R.M. Arrington have done really fascinating work dismantling that naivety. They argue that Ptolemy's history was essentially a calculated exercise in character assassination.
Really? Against who?
Because Ptolemy controlled the narrative, he systematically blackened the reputation of his old rival Perdiccas.
The same Perdiccas whose body he stole from and who died in his tent at the Nile.
The very same. For instance, in the historical accounts of the fall of the city of Thebes, the narrative derived from Ptolemy assigns Perdiccas a reckless, foolish role.
Oh, wow.
And that directly contradicts other surviving accounts. Ptolemy couldn't erase Perdiccas from history, but he could ensure that future generations remembered him as an incompetent failure.
He's literally writing his enemies out of the winner's circle.
He had the pen, so he wrote the story.
That is wild. Okay, so he controls the borders, he controls the currency, he controls the history books.
Yes.
But the final vulnerability for any ruler, the mechanism that usually destroys all this careful planning, is biology.
Succession.
Yes.
The succession. The transition of power is the most dangerous moment for any autocracy. And Ptolemy's family tree was a complete political minefield.
Because he had a lot of wives.
Right. During Alexander's life, he had children with his mistress, Tygus. Later, on Alexander's orders to integrate the empires, he married a Persian noblewoman, Artacama.
Okay, that's two.
But after Alexander's death, Ptolemy needed an alliance with the old Macedonian guard. So he married Eurydice, the daughter of the powerful regent Antipater.
Which produces his eldest legitimate son, Ptolemy Keranos. And by all traditional logic, Keranos is the heir apparent, right? He has the blood of the Egyptian pharaoh and the backing of the traditional Macedonian nobility.
Which is exactly why he was dangerous.
Wait, really?
Because Ptolemy's geopolitical strategy had shifted. He was no longer trying to appease the Macedonian homeland. He was building an independent Egyptian empire.
Ah.
So he marries Eurydice's cousin and lady-in-waiting, Berenice, and he begins to favor the son he has with her, Ptolemy II.
Oh, you can just see the factions forming. The older son, backed by foreign political connections, versus the younger son, born entirely within the new Egyptian power structure.
Exactly. And overlooking the eldest son with deep military connections is a massive gamble. It is the exact scenario that sparks civil wars.
So how does he avoid a war?
He executes the transition with surgical precision. He slowly alienates Keranos, forcing him to eventually flee to a rival court,
He just freezes him out.
effectively neutralizing the Macedonian faction within Egypt.
Yeah.
And he doesn't just name Ptolemy II his heir and hope for the best.
What does he do?
He installs him as co-regent in 285 BC.
Oh, that's smart.
By sharing the throne while he is still alive, Ptolemy ensures that when he eventually dies, there is absolutely no power vacuum. Ptolemy II is already sitting on the throne, controlling the treasury and the army.
Which leads to a quiet end in January of 282 BC. Ptolemy Sutter dies at the age of 84 or 85.
And to appreciate the magnitude of that, you have to look at his peers. Almost every single one of the Diadochi Alexander's successors died violently.
Right, they all killed each other?
They fell in battle, they were assassinated by their own troops, so they were executed.
Yeah.
For a Macedonian warlord to die of old age, in his own bed, having successfully transferred a stable, wealthy kingdom to his chosen heir, it's an astonishing statistical anomaly.
It really forces you to rethink what constitutes a successful reign. I mean, we started this deep dive with the cinematic image of a bodyguard hijacking a golden carriage in the desert.
Right.
But the dramatic heist was really just the entry fee. The real work was administrative.
Completely. He utilized geographic choke points at the Nile, engineered a fiat currency to trap foreign wealth, deployed the Library of Alexandria as a tool of intellectual supremacy, and weaponized his own memoirs.
If you take away anything from this, let it be how you evaluate power. True imperial longevity rarely relies on a conqueror's sword. It relies on the ledgers, the supply lines, and the tax codes that keep the machine running when the charismatic founder is gone.
And it relies on the narratives we blindly accept.
This is
a fascinating final thought.
Yeah.
We've seen how Ptolemy used his eyewitness history to carefully construct his own image and literally rewrite the Mediterranean's memory of his rivals.
Right, using papyrus and patronage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder, if a single ruler in the ancient world could orchestrate a 2,000-year legacy just by monopolizing the physical archives, what does that mean for us today?
Oh, wow.
In a digital age, where data isn't locked in a library in Alexandria, but distributed on servers that can be subtly altered, shadow banned, or rewritten with a keystroke.
That is terrifying. We trust the digital record even more than Arian trusted a king. But the person who controls the algorithm is essentially just a modern Ptolemy holding the pen.
It's the ultimate lesson in narrative control. The hostile takeover doesn't end when you secure the assets or build the moat.
No, it ends when you write the official history, leaving everyone else as a footnote in the dust. Imagine trying to gauge the processing power of a high-end computer, but the only diagnostic tool you have is a bathroom scale.
Right, you just put the laptop on the scale and try to guess if it can render 3D graphics based on how heavy it is.
Exactly. I mean, using a sheer measure of mass to determine complex internal performance makes absolutely zero sense.
Yeah, the tool is fundamentally mismatched to the reality you're trying to capture. You're measuring physical weight when you really should be looking at the internal circuitry.
And that disconnect between the primitive tools we use and the immense complexity of the human body is exactly where we are starting today. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Our mission for this session is to unpack this massive, comprehensive dossier of research on a condition that, as of 2022, affected over 1 billion people worldwide. We are talking about obesity.
Over a billion. It's really staggering when you look at the raw numbers.
It is. And the goal here is to move completely past that tired, oversimplified narrative of, just eat less and move more. We're going to look under the hood at the biology, the built environment, and the historical forces at play.
Because it's so much more than just a behavioral issue.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. Because while obesity carries this heavy social stigma that you see everywhere, medical societies and organizations like the World Health Organization and the American Medical Association officially classify it as a complex chronic disease.
And that classification is the crucial starting line. But to truly understand obesity as a disease, we first have to understand how the medical community actually measures it when you're sitting in your doctor's office.
Which brings us back to the laptop on the scale.
Exactly. This is where your bathroom scale analogy comes in, because our primary diagnostic tool is shockingly flawed.
We're talking about BMI, right? Body mass index.
Yes, BMI.
If you've ever been to a clinic, you know the drill. They take your weight, your height, plug it into a ratio, and spit out a number.
And the standard classifications dictate that a BMI of 25 or higher is overweight, and 30 or higher is obese.
Though the research does note that some East Asian countries use lower thresholds, right? Because those specific populations tend to develop cardiovascular and metabolic risks at a lower total body mass.
Right, they adjust for regional risk factors.
Yeah.
But zooming out, using BMI to measure your overall health is basically like judging a car's engine performance strictly by how heavy the chassis is.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is just how glaring the blind spots of BMI truly are when you apply it to large populations. I mean, it completely ignores variations in tissue type.
Like lean muscle mass versus adipose tissue or fat.
Exactly. And the dossier gives us some incredible real-world stress tests of this metric. According to the standard BMI charts, more than half of all NFL players are classified as obese.
Wow.
And 1 in 4 are extremely obese. But their mean body fat percentage hovers around just 14%.
So you have these elite athletes in peak cardiovascular condition being flagged as medical emergencies on a standardized chart.
Right. The dossier highlights another perfect example, too, a study on college-aged sumo wrestlers.
Oh, I saw that. That was wild.
By strict BMI standards, these athletes are categorized as severely or very severely obese. But when researchers stopped looking at the weight-to-height ratio and actually measured their subcutaneous and visceral fat percentages,
What did they find?
40% of those wrestlers were no longer categorized as having obesity at all. They were just carrying a massive, incredibly dense amount of lean muscle.
So basically, the medical field has been using this really blunt instrument to measure a highly dynamic system.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
And that implies someone could look visibly overweight on the outside, but have, the metabolic engine of a sports car internally. The sources actually mention something called metabolically healthy obesity.
This is a major frontier in current medical research. We're finally moving away from treating everyone with a high BMI as a single monolithic group. The BioShare project actually developed very strict criteria to identify this subgroup. They found individuals with a BMI over 30 who do not exhibit the typical metabolic damage.
So no high blood pressure or anything.
Under their definition, these individuals have completely normal blood pressure, normal blood glucose, normal triglycerides, and healthy cholesterol levels.
Wow.
And all without taking any medications. So they carry the physical weight associated with obesity,
Yeah.
but internally, their cellular machinery is running perfectly smoothly.
That's incredible. But, while it's clear the metric is flawed and some people carry excess weight without immediate metabolic damage, the overarching data for the general population paints a very different picture.
It does. We can't ignore the broader trends.
Right. The health risks of excess body fat are undeniable. The statistics in this dossier are grim. Obesity causes at least 2.8 million deaths annually worldwide.
Yeah, at least 2.8 million.
And on average, it reduces life expectancy by 6 to 7 years. For severe obesity, that number drops by a full decade.
It remains one of the leading preventable causes of death globally. And that's primarily because it's linked to this massive web of secondary conditions or comorbidities.
The list is extensive. I mean, it was the single strongest risk factor for severe COVID-19 outcomes. It's heavily linked to osteoarthritis, depression, cardiovascular disease.
But the numbers for type 2 diabetes really jump off the page.
Yeah, excess body fat underlies 64% of diabetes cases in men and 77% in women. But let's look at the mechanism here. Because fat isn't just a passive storage locker for extra calories.
Right, it's not just sitting there doing nothing.
How is it actually causing this cascading damage across the body?
Well, it comes down to two distinct categories of harm. First, you have the mechanical effects of increased physical mass.
Look at the sheer weight compressing the airway.
Exactly, leading to things like obstructive sleep apnea, or the mechanical wear and tear on joints resulting in osteoarthritis.
That makes sense.
But the second category is chemical, and this is crucial. Adipose tissue, especially visceral fat. The fat around your internal organs is highly biologically active.
Okay.
It functions almost like a toxic endocrine organ, constantly secreting chemicals right into your bloodstream.
Wait, so the body thinks it's constantly dealing with an injury or an infection?
That is the exact biological response. The extra fat creates a chronic, low-grade inflammatory state.
Jeez.
It secretes inflammatory cytokines that travel through the body and physically block the insulin receptors on your muscle and liver cells.
So the insulin is knocking on the door trying to deliver glucose to power the cells, but the fat has effectively changed the locks.
That's a great way to put it. That is exactly how the massive spike in type 2 diabetes occurs.
And the dossier mentions it also creates a prothrombotic state.
Yes.
Meaning the blood itself changes consistency, becoming more prone to dangerous clotting, which obviously skyrockets the risk for strokes and deep vein thrombosis, those dangerous clots that form deep in the legs.
Right, so the body's inflammatory alarms are absolutely blaring.
But here's where it gets really interesting. I was reading through the clinical outcomes, and I hit this massive paradox in the data.
Yeah.
It's literally referred to in the medical literature as the obesity survival paradox.
Yeah, this phenomenon completely flips our standard understanding of weight and mortality on its head.
I mean, the data shows that in certain subgroups of patients, specifically people who already have heart failure or patients undergoing hemodialysis, meaning their kidneys have failed and a machine is filtering their blood,
Right.
having a higher BMI, specifically in the 30.0 to 34.9 range, is actually associated with lower mortality rates than having a normal weight.
It seems completely counterintuitive, right? You have a condition causing chronic inflammation, yet in these specific severe illness scenarios, it acts as a shield.
Yeah, how does that work?
Well, the data has consistently backed this up since it was first described in 1999. And the medical community maintains a few impartial theories to explain the mechanism here. One heavily supported theory revolves around the concept of metabolic reserve.
Meaning the fat is acting as a battery pack for a body under siege.
Exactly the case. Chronic, severe illnesses like advanced heart failure or kidney disease naturally cause dangerous progressive weight loss and muscle wasting.
Right.
Having extra adipose tissue going into a severe illness provides an essential energy reserve. A person starting at a normal weight might quickly become critically underweight, frail, and unable to endure the physical toll of the disease or the heavy treatments.
Whereas the patient with obesity has the metabolic fuel to weather the storm.
Precisely.
Another theory mentioned is a sort of medical bias that accidentally works in the patient's favor.
Yeah, this one is interesting.
Heavy patients who suffer a cardiac event might actually receive far more aggressive, immediate medical treatment from doctors precisely because their weight is seen as a compounding, dangerous risk factor.
Right, which leads to better short-term survival rates. The medical intervention is just dialed up to a 10 immediately.
Wow. So if our biology views fat as this ultimate survival reserve during times of severe illness or famine, it makes total sense why the human body fights so aggressively to accumulate it and keep it.
It does. It's doing what it was designed to do.
This isn't just about someone lacking willpower at the dinner table.
Not at all. The Endocrine Society's official stance is really critical here. They formally state that obesity is a disorder of the energy homeostasis system.
Meaning the balance of energy in and out.
Right. The pathogenesis does involve a sustained positive energy balance, consuming more than you burn. But the core issue is that the body literally resets its internal set point to a higher weight.
And once the body establishes that new, heavier baseline, it views any attempt to lose weight as a threat to its survival.
Exactly.
So if you've ever tried a strict diet and felt like your own brain was sabotaging you, making you obsess over food and feel lethargic, you aren't lacking discipline. Your brain literally thinks you are starving in the wilderness.
Yeah, and the medical field didn't fully understand the mechanics of this biological defense system until 1994, with the breakthrough discovery of a hormone called leptin.
Leptin is the messenger system, right?
Yes, it's produced by your fat cells, and it travels through the blood to act directly on your central nervous system.
Okay.
Specifically, a region of the brain called the hypothalamus, which acts as your metabolic control center.
Zooming in on the hypothalamus, the research describes these distinct neural circuits that control our urge to eat.
Right.
Think of the first group, the NPY and AGRP neurons, like a blaring fire alarm in a building. When they fire, your brain is convinced you're in an emergency starvation scenario, and all you can focus on is finding food. They hit the gas pedal for feeding.
Spot on.
Then the second group, the POMC and CART neurons, act as the system reset button. They silence the alarm, stimulate the feeling of being full, and tell you to stop eating.
And in a healthy system, when you have enough body fat, those fat cells release leptin. The leptin travels to the brain, presses the system reset button by stimulating the fullness neurons, and turns off the fire alarm by inhibiting the hunger neurons.
So if my fat cells are supposed to be telling my brain how much energy we have stored up, there must be a communication breakdown between the fat and the hypothalamus when someone develops obesity.
The messenger gets completely lost in transit. This is a condition called leptin resistance.
Oh.
The person has an abundance of fat cells, and those cells are screaming, pumping out massive amounts of leptin. But the brain's receptors are essentially deaf to the signal.
Wow.
Because the hypothalamus isn't receiving the leptin message, it assumes the body has absolutely no fat. The brain just leaves the hunger fire alarm blaring indefinitely.
That entirely explains the 98% failure rate of pure willpower dieting. You are trying to consciously outthink an unconscious survival alarm.
It's an impossible battle for most people.
And the dossier notes that genetics lay the foundation for this entire circuitry. If you are the offspring of two parents with obesity, you have an 80% chance of developing it yourself.
80%?
Yeah. If both of your parents are of normal weight, that probability drops to less than 10%.
The genetic predisposition is profound. Evolutionary biologists point to the thrifty gene hypothesis.
Right.
This theory suggests that human bodies evolved over millennia to hoard fat efficiently to survive historical famines.
Because food wasn't always available at a drive-thru.
Exactly. The genetic variations that made our ancestors excellent at storing calories allowed them to survive and pass on their DNA. The problem is, in the modern developed world, the famine never arrives.
But human DNA hasn't drastically mutated in the last 50 years. Yet according to the World Health Organization, the global prevalence of obesity more than doubled between 1980 and 2014.
Yeah, a massive spike.
If our underlying genetic code is relatively the same as it was a century ago, something entirely outside of our bodies must be pulling that genetic trigger.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to examine the obesogenic environment. The modern world is perfectly engineered to clash with our ancient survival biology.
The caloric explosion in the global food supply alone is staggering. Looking at the data between 1971 and 2004, the average daily food energy consumed by U.S. women went up by 335 calories.
Right.
For men, it increased by 168 calories. And this wasn't an increase in complex proteins.
No, not at all.
The primary drivers were highly refined carbohydrates, specifically sweetened beverages and processed snacks like potato chips.
Sweetened drinks alone now account for almost 25% of daily food energy in young adults in America. We're drinking our surplus calories before our brain even registers we've consumed anything.
But the food supply is only half the equation.
Yeah, the physical built environment has fundamentally altered how human beings expend energy. In the early 2000s, researcher Lawrence Frank and his colleagues published these highly influential studies on community design.
Okay, what did they look at?
They objectively measured urban form, analyzing residential density, street connectivity, and land use mix to create a mathematical walkability index.
And they proved that our cities are actively changing our physiology.
Absolutely.
They found that a mere 5% increase in a community's walkability index was associated with a 32.1% increase in active time spent walking or biking.
Which correlated to a measurable reduction in BMI across that entire population.
We've literally engineered movement out of our daily lives through mechanized transport, sprawling suburbs, and desk-bound digital labor.
And beyond the obvious culprits of cars and calories, the research outlines a network of invisible environmental drivers.
Invisible drivers.
Yeah. Chronic lack of sleep fundamentally alters those hunger hormones we discussed. And there is exposure to obesogens, synthetic chemical compounds found in plastics and pesticides that act as endocrine disruptors, artificially signaling the body to store fat.
Wow. And the medical interventions themselves can also be drivers.
Oh, definitely.
Certain widely prescribed medications, particularly atypical antipsychotics used for mental health conditions and various antidepressants, cause massive weight gain.
And this isn't just because they make a patient lethargic.
Right. These drugs actively alter the histamine and serotonin receptors in the brain that regulate satiety, sending the patient's appetite into overdrive while simultaneously shifting how the body metabolizes lipids.
But the most cutting-edge invisible driver in the dossier focuses on the microbiome. The trillions of gut bacteria living in your digestive tract actually differ significantly between lean individuals and those with obesity.
Wait, really? So you and your coworker could eat the exact same healthy salad, but because of the specific bacterial ecosystem in your gut, your body might extract significantly more calories from that identical meal.
Yeah, the mechanism is incredible. Certain strains of bacteria that are dominant in the gut flora of individuals with obesity are essentially super harvesters.
Super harvesters.
Yeah, they're highly efficient at breaking down complex, otherwise indigestible plant fibers into short-chain fatty acids, which your intestinal wall can suddenly absorb and store as excess energy.
That is wild.
There's even an emerging field of study called infectobesity, which tracks how certain common adenoviruses might alter cellular metabolism and contribute to weight gain. It's an effect observed across both humans and several animal species.
So when you lay it all out, our biology hoarding fat, our cities preventing us from walking, our food packed with processed sugar, and even our gut bacteria betraying us, it forms a perfect storm.
It really does.
It makes you wonder how society actually views the human bodies caught in the middle of this storm, because the historical context in this dossier shows a massive psychological shift.
Yeah, for the vast majority of human history, mankind's primary overarching struggle was food scarcity.
Right.
Because of that reality, for thousands of years, obesity was the ultimate symbol of wealth, fertility, and prosperity.
You see it immortalized in art, from the Venus of Willendorf figurine carved in 24,000 BC to the portraits of the Renaissance painted by Rubens.
It was an elite status symbol because only the ruling class had the resources to achieve it.
Contrast that with today, where it is heavily stigmatized in modern media, and yet it remains deeply intertwined with economics, just playing out in reverse.
Right. In developed nations, obesity is strongly correlated with economic inequality. Wealthier people are statistically thinner because they can afford the premium cost of fresh, nutritious food, the time to prepare it, and the leisure hours required for physical fitness.
But the dynamic flips when you look at developing nations where the old historical paradigm still exists.
Yes, in areas transitioning their economies, excess weight can still signal financial stability.
The dossier cites a 2023 study from Uganda showing that individuals with obesity actually had better access to financial credit.
Yeah, their weight was perceived by lenders as a visual proxy for wealth and reliability.
Globally, the financial toll of the disease itself is staggering. A 2019 Lancet Commission estimated the global economic cost of obesity at roughly $2 trillion a year.
$2 trillion?
Yeah, representing almost 3% of the world's GDP. The ripple effects touch every industry. Commercial airlines are facing massive spikes in fuel costs and are being forced to redesign seating configurations.
And the healthcare industry is pouring billions into specialized bariatric equipment, engineering wider surgical tables, and heavy-duty ambulances.
At the individual level, the economic penalty is severe too. The research documents massive employment disadvantages. On average, women with obesity earn 6% less than their ideal weight counterparts for doing the exact same jobs.
6%. It's a significant wage gap based entirely on weight.
So when you have an environment that artificially drives up a population's body weight and an economy that financially penalizes women 6% for that exact same weight gain, it's no surprise that this has sparked a massive civil rights pushback. The size acceptance movement, spearheaded by organizations like the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, or NAFA, and the International Size Acceptance Association, actively mobilizes against weight-based employment discrimination and the pervasive social stigma.
And the legal frameworks addressing this friction vary wildly depending on the jurisdiction.
What do you mean?
Well, in 2014, the European Court of Justice issued a landmark ruling stating that if morbid obesity hinders a person's full and effective participation in professional life, it can be legally classified as a disability.
Okay, so it has legal protections there.
Right. This ruling means firing an employee on those physical grounds constitutes illegal discrimination across the EU.
But the legal reality in the United States is entirely different. U.S. courts have generally rejected attempts to recognize obesity as a protected class under the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Yes.
The prevailing legal argument there often hinges on the assumption that the potential public health costs and accommodations required would far exceed the benefits of extending the anti-discrimination protections.
It creates a highly complex intersection of civil rights, municipal public health policy, and sheer corporate economics.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this right now who might be trying to navigate your own health? With the root of the problem so deeply entrenched in our genetics, our brain chemistry, our concrete cities, and our economy, how does modern medicine actually manage this?
The clinical reality detailed in the sources is quite sobering, honestly. Historically, the primary line of defense has been lifestyle intervention.
Doctors prescribing caloric restriction and increased exercise.
Right. But the data shows the success rates for long-term weight loss maintenance using lifestyle changes alone are incredibly low. They range from just 2 to 20% over a 5-year period.
That means up to 98% of people who successfully lose weight through sheer diet and exercise will eventually regain it.
Yes.
That perfectly aligns with the hypothalamic set point mechanism we discussed earlier. The brain simply waits you out, keeping the hunger alarm blaring until you eventually break.
And the research also demystifies the diet industry. When people do manage to succeed long-term, the specific macronutrient breakdown of the diet, whether they're eating low-carb, keto, or low-fat, doesn't matter significantly in the long run.
Really?
The clinical trials show they perform similarly. The singular critical factor is adherence. It is entirely about finding a sustainable pattern you can stick to for decades.
But relying on individual willpower to fight a biological system that thinks it's starving while living in an environment engineered for overconsumption seems like an impossible task for the general public.
It's setting people up to fail.
That's why the World Health Organization emphasizes that obesity is a societal responsibility, not just an individual failure.
Exactly. They're pushing for massive upstream policy changes.
Like implementing global taxes on sugary drinks and systematically breaking up food swamps, those urban areas where communities are flooded with cheap, ultra-processed fast food and have zero access to fresh groceries.
But because environmental and individual interventions are largely failing to stem the tide, the medical field has heavily pivoted to physiological interventions.
Right.
Currently, bariatric surgery remains the most effective long-term treatment.
Procedures like a gastric bypass or a vertical sleeve gastrectomy?
Yeah, they physically alter the digestive tract. By shrinking the stomach volume, it mechanically forces caloric restriction, but more importantly, it fundamentally alters the gut hormones communicating with the brain, severely dampening the appetite.
And the outcomes show a 14 to 25% sustained weight loss at 10 years and a massive 29% reduction in all-cause mortality.
But major abdominal surgery is highly invasive and carries its own risk.
Extremely invasive, which is why the massive shift happening right now is this new wave of injectable medications. Everyone has seen the headlines about GLP-1 agonists.
Drugs like semaglutide and tirzepatide.
Yeah.
These medications are revolutionizing obesity management because they bypass willpower entirely. They work by chemically mimicking the naturally occurring satiety hormones in your gut.
So they essentially trick the brain.
Exactly. They cross the blood-brain barrier and artificially press that POMC system reset button in the hypothalamus. They turn off the fire alarm, drastically slowing gastric, emptying and silencing the constant mental chatter about food.
The weight loss results in the clinical trials are unprecedented for a medication, but the dossier explicitly notes a massive catch to this pharmaceutical revolution.
There's always a catch.
Because the medication is artificially suppressing the set point, the moment the patient stops taking the injections, the brain's original programming boots back up.
Right. The research shows people regain, on average, 50 to 70% of lost weight within just 1 year of stopping the treatment.
So these drugs are not a cure that rewires the system.
No, they are chronic treatment.
Right.
To maintain the health benefits, the patient has to stay on the medication indefinitely.
Let's synthesize all of this. What this massive stack of research makes crystal clear is that obesity is not a moral failing or a lack of character.
Absolutely not.
It is a complex chronic disease. It is the result of a violent collision between our ancient survival biology, which is beautifully designed to hoard energy and reset our weight thermostats higher to protect us from famine, and a modern world that is highly engineered for extreme physical convenience and packed with calorically dense, nutrient-poor food.
And this raises a truly profound question. If the root cause of the global obesity epidemic is our highly engineered modern environment, from our unwalkable, sprawling cities to the absolute ubiquity of subsidized ultra-processed food, what does it say about our society that our primary solutions are to surgically alter our healthy digestive tracts, or to rely on lifetime subscriptions to expensive appetite-suppressing medications, rather than doing the hard work of fixing the toxic environment we built?
We're essentially trying to medicate ourselves out of a structural trap we designed. It brings us right back to the beginning. It's exactly like using a bathroom scale to check a computer's processing speed. We are applying highly specific individual medical tools to treat a systemic environmental reality. The next time you find yourself frustrated by a diet or navigating a city that requires a car just to buy an apple, remember the invisible forces at play. Keep questioning the world around you, look closely at the environment you're moving through every day, and thank you for joining us on this deep dive. You know, when we try to picture the Middle Ages, the default color palette in our collective imagination is, well, it's usually just mud brown and stone gray.
Right. Very drab. Very heavy.
Exactly. I mean, we literally call it the Dark Ages. Everything in that era just feels incredibly heavy. The architecture of the time, the Romanesque style, it was dominated by these thick walls, tiny slit windows.
Castles and churches that look like they're practically sinking into the earth under their own weight.
Yes.
Sinking, because it was an architecture that functioned exactly like a fortress.
Yeah.
It was designed primarily to keep a chaotic, dangerous, and unpredictable world out. The driving force was defense. And, when your priority is defense, you build with mass and solidity.
But then, right in the middle of all this heavy, dark defensive stone, someone decides to pivot entirely.
A massive pivot.
Someone decides to essentially build a towering house of glass to catch the sun. It's a complete 180-degree turn from defense to divine light. And if you've ever walked down a city street and looked up at a soaring modern skyscraper, you might not realize it, but you are looking at an echo of the technology born in that exact moment.
You really are.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, The Learner. Today we are exploring two massive encyclopedic overviews covering the parallel evolutions of Gothic architecture and Gothic art.
Which is such a fascinating topic.
It is. Our mission today is to uncover how a style originally meant to bring divine light into the world, completely revolutionized engineering, transformed how we connect with art, and basically laid the groundwork for the modern, bustling cities you see today.
It truly is one of the most radical, abrupt shifts in human expression. We're talking about the birth of a style that completely shattered the architectural laws of physics as they understood them.
Yeah.
It forced builders to invent entirely new structural systems that changed the skyline of Europe forever.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we have to start by addressing the massive elephant in the room here, which is the word Gothic.
Oh, yes.
There is a widespread misconception about what that word actually means. When I say Gothic today, you probably picture like black eyeliner, brooding poets, a spooky haunted mansion, or just something inherently dark.
Naturally. That's the pop culture definition.
Right. But in the 12th century, when this style was actually born in northern France, it had absolutely nothing to do with darkness.
Quite the opposite, actually. It started in the Ile-de-France region, specifically at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, under the direction of Abbot Suger.
Sugar, right.
Yeah, Suger was a highly influential figure. He was a close advisor to French kings. And his core motivation for this new architecture was entirely theological.
How so?
Well, he was heavily influenced by the writings of a 6th century mystic who taught that all light was a literal emanation of the divine.
Oh, wow.
So for sugar, taking away the thick walls and bringing in light wasn't just, a nice aesthetic choice. It was bringing God directly into the building.
It was literal.
Exactly. He wanted to replace those oppressive Romanesque walls with luminous stained glass to elevate the faithful from the material mud of the earth to the immaterial beauty of heaven.
And because it started in France with this beautiful, uplifting theology, they certainly didn't call it Gothic.
No, not at all.
It was originally known simply as Opus Franciginum, which translates to French work, or sometimes Opus Modernum, meaning modern work.
Right.
So if the whole point of this architecture was to create light, beauty, and cutting-edge elegance, how did this barbarian insult the word Gothic stick for so long? Because historically, the Goths were the actual barbarian tribes that sacked Rome centuries earlier.
It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
The term was actually born out of pure, unadulterated snobbery during the Italian Renaissance in the 16th century.
So hundreds of years later.
Hundreds of years later, you have writers like Giorgio Vasari and legendary artists like Raphael who were utterly obsessed with reviving classical Roman and Greek antiquity.
Right, the columns and domes.
Exactly. They valued what we call the classical orders. Think of the strict mathematical symmetry, the clean horizontal lines, the round arches, and the perfectly proportioned columns of ancient temples.
Okay.
When they looked north at this towering, spiky, highly intricate French architecture, they were repulsed. Vasari literally called it a monstrous and barbarous disorder in his 1550 book, Lives of the Artists.
Monstrous and barbarous.
Yeah. Because it lacked the strict rules of Roman architecture, he decided to blame the Goths, the people who destroyed ancient Roman buildings, for inventing this new style.
It's essentially an architectural smear campaign.
It really is.
It reminds me of like a classical music snob in the 1950s hearing a screaming electric guitar in rock and roll for the first time and just dismissing it as barbarian noise.
That's a great way to put it.
They completely miss the structural genius of the music because it doesn't fit into their preferred rigid framework of what good music should sound like. But if the whole point was to create light and beauty, how did this barbarian insult stick for so long?
Well, that captures the dynamic perfectly. The Renaissance classicists controlled the historical narrative, so their insult became the permanent name. But what's fascinating here is how fundamentally wrong Vasari was about the sophistication of the style.
He just didn't get it.
No, true Gothic was never about barbaric destruction or chaos. It was a deliberate, highly intellectual leap into light. And to achieve that light, they couldn't just knock holes in stone walls. They had to completely rethink how a building stays standing.
Which brings us to the actual mechanics of how they reach the heavens. Because building a skeletal house of glass that reaches hundreds of feet into the air requires some serious structural technology.
Oh, absolutely.
Our sources highlight the big three of Gothic engineering, which are the pointed arch, the rib vault, and the flying buttress. Let's start with the pointed arch because the sources point out that the European-centric narrative we often hear takes way too much credit for this invention.
It really does. The pointed arch was not invented by the Goths nor the French. The polymath architect, Christopher Wren, famously noted in the 17th century that the style really should have been called the Saracen style.
The Saracen style.
Yeah, because pointed arches were a thriving staple of Islamic architecture centuries before the first Gothic cathedral was ever even conceived.
Wow.
If you look at the 8th century mosque cathedral of Cordoba in Spain, the pointed arch is already there. It likely filtered into Europe through the Islamic presence in Spain and Sicily, or via...
The Gothic builders took that pointed arch and just pushed it to its absolute limit.
That they did.
Like if you think about a traditional Roman round arch, it basically looks like a rainbow. When you put thousands of pounds of stone on top of a rainbow shape, the weight inherently wants to push the sides outward.
Right, it flattens out.
Exactly, which means you need incredibly thick walls to keep the building from flattening out. But a pointed arch looks more like a pair of praying hands.
Yes.
It channels that immense weight much more steeply downward, directly into the supporting columns.
That verticality is the key. By directing the thrust downwards rather than outwards, the arch itself becomes much more stable. But, the pointed arch alone wasn't enough to build the cathedrals they envisioned.
They needed more.
They had to combine it with the rib vault.
Oh.
This is a structural ceiling where the stone ribs act as a load-bearing skeleton, and the webbing in between is relatively light stone.
I always think of it like an umbrella. The ribs of the umbrella hold the shape, and the fabric is just stretched between them.
That's a perfect analogy.
And the final piece of that puzzle is the flying buttress. The sources describe these as an exoskeleton holding the building taut, but it's hard to visualize just how dynamic they actually are.
They are very dynamic.
It's not just a prop leaning against a wall. The way I understand it, it's basically an invisible, perpetual wrestling match in the sky.
I love that.
Because all that heavy stone in the vaulted ceiling still generates lateral thrust, it inherently wants to push outward and collapse the walls. The flying buttresses are those iconic half arches on the outside of the building, pushing inward against the walls with the exact same amount of force.
Yes.
They freeze the building in tension.
A perpetual wrestling match is a brilliant way to describe the physics at play, because the rib vaults on the inside and the flying buttresses on the outside were locked in this tension, doing all the heavy lifting and transferring the thrust to massive stone piers away from the building. The walls themselves were completely freed from their structural duty.
The walls didn't have to hold the roof up anymore.
Exactly. That meant they could become incredibly thin, and eventually the stone walls could be replaced almost entirely by sheets of glass.
Okay, I get the theological motivation for the glass, bringing in the divine light, but I find myself wondering about the human ego behind all of this.
Oh, there was plenty of ego.
We talk about Abbot Sugar's pure quest for divine light, but you see these cities building higher and higher and higher. Were these builders genuinely just trying to glorify God, or was this a massive, ego-driven medieval space race between rival cities trying to build the biggest, flashiest billboard?
Well, that is a very modern, slightly cynical way to look at it, though, I mean, it's understandable.
Right.
We really shouldn't underestimate the genuine, visceral fear of hellfire and the deep devotion of the medieval mindset. For them, bankrupting a town to build a monument to the Virgin Mary was a literal investment in their eternal souls.
That makes sense.
However, you cannot separate that deep religious zeal from raw civic pride and economics. A soaring cathedral told the world, this city is powerful, and our local guilds have the finest craftsmen.
It was a flex.
A huge flex. Structures like Amiens or Chartres attracted tens of thousands of pilgrims, which acted as a massive economic engine. It was holy devotion, seamlessly blended with a tourism boom.
And just like a space race, that blend of devotion and competition drove them to push the technology until it literally snapped.
Yes, it did.
They were fiercely competing for height. Chartres Cathedral pushed the ceiling to 38 meters. Then Amiens reached 42 meters. And then the builders at Beauvais Cathedral decided to go for an astonishing 48 meters.
Massive.
That's over 150 feet of pure vertical interior space, held up by practically nothing but tension and glass.
And at Beauvais, they finally found the terrifying physical limits of stone and mortar.
What happened?
In 1284, under the sheer stress of wind loads across that massive height and perhaps slight shifts in the foundation, a portion of the soaring choir at Beauvais collapsed.
Oh, wow. It fell apart.
Completely collapsed. You can imagine the psychological shock of that moment, the realization that they had pushed God's materials further than the laws of physics would allow.
That must have been terrifying for them.
It sent shockwaves through Europe. They actually had to convene panels of architectural experts from places like Siena and Chartres to study the stability of these massive structures. That collapse effectively ended the reckless race for the absolute tallest ceiling.
Which forced the master builders to pivot. If they couldn't build higher, they were going to build more beautifully.
Exactly.
They focused entirely on elaborate, awe-inspiring decoration. And the art they used to fill these skeletal cages of glass was a massive departure from the era before it. It became a highly emotional, three-dimensional multimedia experience.
It did. The stained glass alone is a technological marvel. Look at Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, built by King Louis IX in the 1240s.
It's gorgeous.
The walls are virtually non-existent. It's just 15-meter-high sheets of light containing over 1,000 individual biblical scenes.
1,000.
Over 1,000. And creating this wasn't just a matter of painting on clear glass. Monks and alchemists had to figure out how to melt metal oxides like cobalt for deep blue or copper for ruby red directly into the molten glass at extreme furnace temperatures without shattering the delicate panes.
That sounds incredibly dangerous.
It was dangerous, highly specialized chemistry.
The atmosphere inside must have been intoxicating. But it wasn't just the light that changed. The physical sculptures evolved dramatically, too.
Yes, they did.
If you look at Romanesque art or classic Byzantine icons, the figures are very flat, rigid, and stiff. They look past you, staring off into eternity. But Gothic sculpture literally breaks out of the wall and gets personal.
We see a sudden dramatic shift toward naturalism. The statues begin to mimic the real world.
Right.
The Virgin Mary is no longer depicted as just a stiff, unapproachable queen sitting rigidly on a throne. She becomes an affectionate, swaying, aristocratic mother. You often see her playfully interacting with the infant Christ.
She feels human.
Exactly. And speaking of Christ, devotional practices introduce depictions of his extreme physical vulnerability. You see the rise of the Man of Sorrows motif, emphasizing his physical wounds and exhaustion. The artist wanted the viewer to feel a deep, empathetic connection to the divine.
They wanted to elicit raw emotion, but they also knew how to elicit pure terror.
Oh, yes.
We have to talk about the monsters, the gargoyles, and the grotesques. I have to admit I was somewhat disappointed, but also amazed by what the sources revealed here.
Go on.
So you're telling me the most iconic, spooky feature of a Gothic cathedral, the gargoyle, is essentially just a highly decorated medieval rain gutter.
It does ruin the spooky mystique just a bit, doesn't it?
It really does.
But yes, true gargoyles were entirely functional. Think about the massive surface area of a cathedral roof during a storm.
It's a lot of water.
Without gargoyles, absolute torrents of rainwater would cascade down the sides of the building, and that constant sheet of water would quickly erode the delicate mortar, binding those thin, stressed stone walls together.
Oh, and bring the whole thing down.
Exactly. The gargoyles captured the water, channeled it through a cut in their backs, and spat it safely outward, far away from the flying buttresses.
I will never look at them the same way, literally spitting medieval rainwater to save the engineering.
Pretty much.
But the sources also distinguish these from grotesques, which weren't functional gutters. Like the Strix, which was a creature from Roman mythology that looked like a terrifying owl or bat and was rumored to eat human flesh.
Right.
If it isn't protecting the mortar, why carve a flesh-eating bat onto a church?
Because it's protecting the soul. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the grotesques served a vital psychological purpose.
How so?
You have to remember who this building was designed for, a public where the vast majority of people were completely illiterate. These structures were the ultimate multimedia storytelling devices.
So the building was a textbook.
Every single detail, from the gutter to the floor tiles, was a textbook you could walk through. While the beautiful stained glass inside told the hopeful stories of saints and salvation, the terrifying grotesques on the outside were a visceral, visual warning about the demons and spiritual dangers lurking outside the safety of the church's teachings.
That makes a lot of sense. Even the floors were part of the curriculum. The sources mention these intricate, swirling labyrinths lead into the floor tiles at cathedrals like Chartres.
Oh, the labyrinths are fascinating.
A pilgrim would literally walk, or sometimes crawl, through this complicated, twisting maze on the ground to physically enact the difficult, winding Christian journey to paradise.
Every single detail was intentional. From the functional rain gutter to the labyrinth beneath your feet to the specific chemistry of colors in the glass, yellow symbolized intelligence, blue represented perseverance. It was an entire cohesive universe of knowledge and emotion contained in a single building.
But all that wealth, engineering genius, and artistic innovation generated by the cathedral building boom couldn't be contained to just the church forever.
No, it couldn't.
Because once you invent an architectural style that perfectly broadcasts power, wealth, and elegance, the rising classes are going to want it for themselves.
And that leads to a massive societal shift in the 14th and 15th centuries. Following the plagues and the expansion of trade routes, you see the rise of a money-based economy and incredibly powerful trade guilds.
The middle class, basically.
So suddenly, there's this new bourgeois class. Wealthy merchants, bankers, and master craftsmen who have the disposable income and the desire to display their newfound success.
So the Gothic style breaks out of the religious sphere and goes completely secular. We see it adapted for massive civic buildings, the town halls in Flanders, the universities like Oxford and Cambridge.
Yes, King's College Chapel is a great example.
And the Doge's Palace in Venice is a perfect example of this too. They took the pointed arches and the airy, lacy stone tracery of the cathedrals and used it to build a seat of government that looked impossibly light and elegant, hovering over the water.
Beautiful building.
Or the Old New Synagogue in Prague, where Jewish communities adopted the Gothic rib vaults, the cutting-edge engineering of the day, to create a beautiful, towering space for their own worship. The style basically became a universal language.
It really was the definitive architectural language of authority and civic pride. But perhaps the most significant cultural shift wasn't in the massive civic buildings, but in the scale and ownership of the art itself.
What do you mean?
Well, with this new wealth, individuals could now purchase private art for their own homes and bodies.
Ah, the rise of portable art.
Yes.
The sources describe these intricately carved ivory mirror cases depicting scenes of courtly romance, used as high-end engagement presents,
Very fancy.
and illuminated books of hours, which were highly decorated, pocket-sized books for personal prayer, written on incredibly delicate vellum. The one made for Queen Jeanne d'Evreux is mentioned as a masterpiece of personal luxury.
It's exquisite.
If I look at it through the lens of those ivory mirrors and pocket prayer books, it feels like we are looking at the birth of the individual consumer.
Oh.
These are basically early smartphones. Highly personalized, highly portable status symbols that you carried around to show people who you were.
You hit the nail on the head. It democratized identity and consumption. We even see the production of cheap, mass-produced, stamped lead pilgrimage badges.
Like little pins.
Exactly. Everyday people would buy these pins to prove they had visited a shrine, or even to show political loyalty, like the thousands of white boar badges King Richard III handed out to his supporters.
And as the art becomes more personal, the people making it step out of the shadows. Because of the strict record-keeping and quality control of the trade guilds, artists actually started signing their names to their work to protect their trade secrets and build their brands.
That's a huge turning point.
They were no longer just anonymous laborers chipping away at a cathedral wall. They were recognized, individual creators with reputations. So what does this all mean for the grand scheme of history?
It means that the Gothic style evolved far beyond a top-down religious mandate dictated by a king or a pope. It organically adapted into a flexible language for education, government, and personal identity. By elevating the artisan from an anonymous laborer to the status of a recognized artist, the Gothic era really set the stage for the modern relationship we have with art, commerce, and personal expression today.
So, bringing this all together for you, the learner, the next time you walk down a city street and look up at a soaring skyscraper with a sheer glass curtain wall, or the next time you buy a souvenir pin at a concert to prove you were there, realize that you are participating in a cultural legacy started by Gothic master builders and guild artists.
A legacy of light.
Exactly. What began as Abbot Sugar's quest to capture divine light sparked a total engineering revolution. They borrowed the brilliant pointed arches of Islamic architecture, invented towering stone exoskeletons that engaged in a perpetual wrestling match with gravity, and birthed a highly emotional art style that paved the way for modern urban life.
And I think we should leave you with the sheer historical irony of all this.
Oh, the snobs.
Right. Consider the irony that the Renaissance thinkers, like Vasari, deliberately branded this style Gothic to associate it with the barbarian destruction of civilization. They genuinely believed it was the death of classical refinement.
But they were wrong.
Entirely. Yet, by pioneering groundbreaking engineering, encouraging personal literacy through illuminated manuscripts, and elevating the individual artist, the Gothic era actually built the very bridge of civilization that made the Renaissance itself possible.
From heavy, dark stone fortresses designed to keep the chaotic world out, to towering, fragile houses of glass inviting the light in, guided by what was essentially a barbarian insult, think about that the next time you walk into a dark room and flip on a light switch. Keep learning, keep exploring, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.